want to begin by welcoming both Chris and Maneesh, and I'll give some background to our session. But why don't I first introduce both Chris and Maneesh? So I think I have now known Chris for almost 20 years when we used to work together at a company called Siebel that I'm pretty sure a wide majority of this audience would not even know of or have heard of or remember at this point in time, got acquired by Oracle. Uh, he was then at a startup called Uncover, followed by NetApp, spent a decent amount of time at Atlassian, where he led the global revenue ops and also led the global SMB sales, and is now the chief revenue officer of Sentry. And I'm hoping that Sentry needs no introduction to this audience at least. And if anybody needs an introduction to Sentry, then I think they're in the wrong webinar here. So let me also introduce Maneesh. Maneesh and I were colleagues back at SAP. This was 2007 onwards. We spent actually almost 6 years together from that point onwards. Maneesh is currently the country head of GitHub, prior to which he was also the chief revenue officer of a startup in the edtech SaaS space called WizIQ. Spent rest of his time at 3 large companies, which includes Adobe, SAP, and Sun Microsystems. And his distinction, as we were joking, was to take products to market that nobody else wanted to take it, but these were largely the core tech products in these companies that Maneesh took to market. So guys, both of you, thank you so much for joining, particularly Chris. I know that you're joining from the Bay Area, so this is highly, highly appreciated. But just to set some context to this SaaS Talks, I think those of you who have attended many of these in the past, most of our SaaS Talks have been driven by different go-to-market topics on the application SaaS space. Anagh and I, who are both colleagues at Stellaris, we have been, in the last couple of years, spending a lot of time in looking at developer SaaS companies. And we do realize that while India has built a lot of muscle in taking application SaaS companies to global markets, we saw Zoho, we saw Freshworks. Now, doesn't matter what kind of a beat, what kind of ACV, what kind of target segment, what kind of geography an application SaaS company is, I think you will find good parallels for success in India for that kind of a go-to-market. That is not so true yet in developer-focused SaaS. Yes, there have been a few. We have seen Browser Stack, Lambda Test, Postman, and a few others. But I would argue that you can still count them on your fingers. And we are still learning how to do go-to-market for developer-focused products. So the intent of today's session is to go deeper into this. Like most other SaaS talks, this is going to be initially driven by Anagh and I. We will monopolize the question for the first 15-20 minutes to set the stage. Thereafter, it's going to be open to anyone. You feel free to ask questions. Those of you who want to raise your hand and actually want to come in onto the screen as you ask your questions, you are welcome to. We'll actually promote you to the screen. That way you can have a much livelier discussion. Only request is please stick to the topic and not go off topic as you ask your questions. That's the only request we would like to make. So with that, we'll get started. And Maneesh, I'm actually going to start with you. Given that you're sitting in one of the hottest seats in India today as the country head of GitHub. In the recent years, and I can say especially for Indian companies, since we have seen the success of Postman, Hasura, several other companies, open source has been one of the most talked about go-to-market methodologies for developer-focused companies. Many founders that we meet, they're thinking about open source, and the assumption is that if you go open source, that leads to a very fast distribution very, very rapidly, right? It's almost like that there is a running train, you just need to step onto it, and you will just go places once you're on that train. Would love to understand from your perspective, as you have seen now many companies, what kind of companies are actually suited for open source, even within the developer-focused world, and those that are actually not.
Thanks, Alok, and hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from. Super excited to be here with Chris to talk about developer go-to-market. Alok makes me feel very old talking about the past. But I think the past is an interesting point. Alok, before I jump onto the open source question, I was just thinking about, the conversation you and I had almost 10 years back. We used to talk about SaaS companies back in 2012 and 2013. And we were deliberating on what's the go-to-market for product companies coming out of India. Is there a go-to-market? How do they scale? And fast forward 10 years, I don't think anybody wants to talk about SaaS anymore. It's an established fact. I think the exact same thing is happening for dev products. Whether you talk about open core products, or you talk about open source companies, or you talk about just regular, SaaS dev focused companies, I think the time has come. It's the melting point of the ecosystem, with a large set of B2C companies, B2B SaaS companies, with the whole GSI ecosystem, with the whole GCC ecosystem. I think the ecosystem of tech is fueling this whole dev go-to-market, which all of us are going to talk about today. Let's get to the point that you asked. I think it's a tricky question. You don't open source just for the sake of open sourcing, assuming that you will get distribution. Distribution, I would say, is a side effect of open source. And I think it's very important to talk about the whole open source concepts too, right? I think the audience and everybody should go and sort of look at open source projects versus open core companies. Both are very different types of go-to-market. If you look at open source projects, there are many. And I was reading a book recently, which I like 2x2 matrix. They talked about high contribution to an open source project, low contribution to an open source project, high user growth and low user growth. And they sort of plotted open source projects to begin with, because not every open source project is successful, right? Just by opening the code and asking developers to come doesn't mean that anybody would use it. I think it's important to realize a couple of things. First, what is that problem that you're trying to solve in the dev or tech space? Right? Because the interesting thing about dev products is, developers go and look for solution on their own. You don't sell to developers directly. They face some problem in the code that they're writing or the infra that they're trying to deploy. They're not able to do something, they go out and search for it, right? If they find something which is readily available, they use it. So there are lots of developers across the world for 30, 40, 50 years who've been open sourcing projects. Now, monetizing an open source project is where the question comes in. So there are companies, as you know, who have created open core and built a business model on top of it, whether it is services, whether it is support or premium features. So I think as a company in India or a founder in India thinks about open source, I don't think they should just think about distribution. They should think about all the other stuff that goes around it before doing it. For example, if you're open sourcing it, your product, how are you going to get contributors? Because it's not that you just open sourced your code and you have a team of 100 people maintaining that code. Then it's just your own product which you have the code open. What you really want as a developer company is to have developers and contributors from all over the world to work on your product. That's where the network effects come in, which in turn creates distribution effects. So it's the classic question of cart before the horse or the horse before the cart. I think sitting back and understanding what you really want to do as a strategy for your open core product is how you should start with. TLDR, there is no silver bullet. I think it needs to be really thought through. You have Sentry as a great example, which is open source and has a great go-to-market. And there are companies which are closed source, but they might have pieces of open source as well. So there are trade-offs and benefits on all sides.
Actually, Chris, because Maneesh picked on you right in the end on Sentry.
Yeah.
I'm curious. Actually, I don't know the history on your go-to-market approach, but did you start out as a open source company, or was that an afterthought later? And how did you?
No. It absolutely, and I'm not an expert on the history of Sentry, but it definitely started as an open source project. So David Kramer, the founder of Sentry, essentially was a Dropbox and had a problem that he tried to solve. So he actually wrote the code put it on a GitHub repository and started that way and got some traction on it essentially, right? Because it was a problem that many others were facing, the issue of figuring out what happens to your code once you deploy it, the errors, and how do you get the context of those errors, bring that back to the developer and get them fixed essentially. So it started as an open source project. He got traction on it. They decided then to essentially offer a SaaS version, just the hosted version of the open source product. And in our case, there's actually no difference between the two, and made that available for sale. And so got traction with that, and really got significant traction before they decided to add any salespeople to the mix. So it's a very classic kind of successful open source project to product-led growth to then now kind of a scaling of the go-to-market motion with salespeople.
Well, if I can just add on to that, looking at history is also interesting. If you go back, I'm old, 20, 30 years, we had developer tools. We had developer tools like Rational, we had Mercury, we had Borland. Were they open source? They were not, right? Yeah. Did they achieve distribution? They did. They followed a very different model. If you picked up any developer back in the late 90s or early 2000s, chances are they would be using a load runner, they would be using a Rational UML tool. And the distribution model in the back old days was your traditional reseller model. So there was a reseller going into every company and positioning these developer tools. But a lot of the go-to-market happened with evangelism. But at the same time, if you still see that era, you also had MySQL. And MySQL did not have resellers, but it was an open source project which every developer was using. And the reason they were using it was because if somebody wanted to start off with an application, they had to procure licenses for an Oracle database or something else. And MySQL sort of democratized access to database, which led to adoption. So different approaches to both of these. And when you and Chris were talking about this, just popped in my head.
Yeah, and Maneesh, but that still brings that question, which is, if you are someone in the audience who is an early stage entrepreneur building that developer focused product today, I think it's very clear that you could have a go-to-market which is either open source, or it may be just a classic commercial go-to-market that we understand. The question is, sitting in their shoes, how do you make a judgment call which is a better approach for them to take? Because that's a judgment call that every entrepreneur has to take. So how would you, what are the 2 or 3 parameters that one would sort of count on to be able to make the judgment call? Either of you, please feel free to take that question.
Sure, I can take a stab at it as well. Go ahead, Chris, go ahead.
Well, I was going to give a quick answer, really. Like, I think what we're seeing is kind of a wave in the market where open source systems are clearly gaining more traction than proprietary systems, right? And we experience it as well. If you look at like the broader observability market that we're a part of, there is clearly a trend towards moving away from these proprietary players systems where you're locked in, because obviously with open source, there is always that possibility that you have, or at least in the buyer's mind, there is the impression that they can always move back to hosting it themselves and running it themselves, just like in our case. And so that creates essentially some kind of a set of good vibes around the product, and it's something that we see more and more, whether it's like Grafana, competing more and more with the Datadogs of this world, or other products like that, right? Where you see clearly that open source is gaining traction just because of that kind of confidence community aspect of it.
And I can also give a sort of business context to this, Alok and everyone, which is what is the category that you're entering in? So whatever all of you founders have created, are you getting into something which already is an established category with players, versus have you created something which is new and you need to do the concept sell? So both have a very different approach, and there are lots of different examples. Let's take a few examples from India itself. So if you look at Chatwood, right? Chatwood is in the quote unquote CRM space. They have entered a category which everybody's in. Right from HubSpot provides these things, Salesforce has it. We have more companies from India like Zoho and Freshworks. So they have entered a category which is already established. So for them, they don't have to do the concept sell of what their product has to do. Being available as open source with the open core model, the distribution is easy. But if I am creating a product which needs a lot of concept cell, then I will rethink just by open source, will it accelerate acquisition of developers? Question mark, right? I would love to debate this out, because if you created a developer product, as I said, you don't go out and sell to developers. You need it to be discovered. You need developers to come to you, right? So if you've identified a problem that everybody's facing, you're solving for that, and then people will come to you. I love what Chris said, how Sentry was founded. The developer working in Dropbox identified a problem, tried to solve it, open sourced it, and ran that as a separate company because it was broad enough for other developers to want to solve. So I think, Alok, to answer your question again, if a founder is looking at open sourcing their product / company, I think they will have to think about these fundamentals too.
Got it. I'm going to ask my last question, and Anagh, please chime in post that, and we can open it. But Chris, given your background, I'm tempted to ask a very different question to you. Classically, we all think open source, PLG motions, developers not wanting to be sold to, all that stuff. I remember that when I met you, and we go back to that breakfast 5-6 years back in the Bay Area, you were at that point, in fact, thinking about or had started setting up an enterprise go-to-market motion, even in Atlassian.
Yeah.
And I believe that you have or are doing it at Sentry as well. So the question is, at what point do you begin to think of combining a classical sales motion into a product-led growth motion? And how easy or not so easy is it to make that transition when you develop a PLG DNA? How do you transition to a sales-led growth DNA in the same organization?
Yeah. I mean, the question is whether you want to essentially go up market or not, right? And when you start selling to enterprises, they will somehow pull you into it. That's kind of the classic way that Atlassian got into it, right? So you start selling into large companies. There is all the stuff that comes with that, right? Like the security checks, the procurement processes, and all of these things that just cannot be done in a PLG way. And so that's kind of the organic way of getting there. And I would say, the ideal way is to kind of let PLG take its path and have the patience to let it unfold so that you can really benefit from that initial broad distribution and build on top of it. I would say when you start to layer in sales, there is a couple of things that typically happen. I'd say the first one is somewhat of an intolerance for salespeople in a typical PLG company, right? And that comes from the fact that generally people who have founded PLG companies have had generally little exposure to salespeople, or if they have, it's the worst kind, right? And I don't know what it's like to buy a car in India, but if you buy a car in the US, it's a terrible experience. And so people associate that model with that's what a salesperson is. And obviously there's a strong aversion to that. So I would encourage people that are, if you are going to go up market at some point, you should start early in the DNA and in the culture of your company. Start to incorporate that notion that at some point you will have salespeople, that they have a function and that they're important to your go-to-market strategy. So that's kind of one element, the kind of cultural prep for that insertion of salespeople at some point. The second thing I'd say is to really take the strengths of PLG and preserve that as you layer in sales. So the goal of adding salespeople is to make sure that you build on top of the momentum that you have in your PLG flywheel, right? And that you figure out where you can essentially augment that momentum through the addition of salespeople. And that's something that is critical to think through. Specifically what I've seen with some companies that try to grow faster and therefore start adding salespeople, that you start putting in these unnatural hurdles to procuring your products, right? Where you suddenly say, well, certain products are only available through salespeople. You have to call us to get the price of the product. Like, I would encourage people to stay away from that and to stick as much as you can with transparent pricing models, for example, where everything is available on your website. Now, that may not be the optimal for short-term margin optimization, but from a long-term growth perspective, I've seen this play out at Atlassian. It is amazing and it works, and you will recoup the margin later, right? So it's like preserve those things that are really the power of PLG, and just figure out where sales can plug into it and add value to that sales motion, or allow you to kind of scale beyond the customers that you would typically sell to. And then finally, I would say, what happens when you start to convert from a PLG motion? Ultimately, a PLG motion is focused on the end user, right? And so typically the marketing teams in PLG companies have a strong focus on selling the benefits to the end user. Like, what is the value of this feature that helps me do my job better day to day? That's a micro benefit to an individual user that gets you that kind of momentum and essentially the propagation that you want in a PLG model. When you start to sell into more senior people and you have to go collect checks that are 100, 200, 300, $1 million, you have to somehow be able to translate that micro benefit to a macro benefit at the company level. And that, generally, PLG companies are not good at that initially. So you have to also bring in the people who have the experience of doing so, and the salespeople who have the experience of articulating those kinds of narratives back to the customer. So those are kind of the three things: culture, preserve or blend them together in a way that you have the power of both, and they essentially reinforce each other. And then finally, make sure that you kind of have the narratives ready to address the needs of the people that you're going to ask the money from, essentially.
Very well articulated, Chris. Anagh, if you want to chime in, or if you want to read up one of the audience questions, go for it.
In fact, actually on the last point as well, for benefit of people in the audience, Chris has a very good piece written about how to blend enterprise sales with PLG. Since I saw that on your profile a few days back, it's very succinctly described these things. So for people in the audience, I encourage to check that out. We'll take a question from the audience, but just one thing I wanted to ask Maneesh before that, because the role of a developer relations team, right? There's some confusion around it, some, I would say, lack of familiarity around it with a lot of tech founders that are coming up in India. So what do you think, Maneesh, is the greatest leverage that a DevRel team brings? And at what point should a startup, like dev startup in particular, make its first DevRel hire?
Got it. There was some crackle in your voice, so just for the audience, Anagh was asking about DevRel and when should DevRel start. I think for a tech or dev-focused company, DevRel is essential. If you think about it, the founder in itself, whether it is the founder of the company of a dev product or founder of an open source project, they are the biggest evangelist. That evangelist itself is the starting point of DevRel. Because when you create this product/solution, you want developers to use it. And Chris talked about the beautiful PLG model. And the starting point of a dev PLG is evangelism, is actually DevRel. Evangelism is DevRel. Going out and telling developers that this is the micro feature or micro problem that you're facing that my product can help you solve, so that there is adoption. And then looking at community effects of one person using it and talking about it to the other person. The evangelist / the founder has to go out into forums, talk about it to other practitioners. Why should they use your solution? Because the other thing that we're not talking about is also that the developer space is also getting very crowded. Right? So there are lots and lots of products that are out there. Why should your product be used?
Yeah.
Now, it's not, the go-to-market is not about sending more mailers. It's not about attending more conferences. It's about having that technical depth, which developers can understand. So that's where DevRel comes in, Anagh and team, that DevRels are tech people with a focus on helping fellow developers adopt a product or use a product. So they are also practitioners. They understand the pain that the other person would be going through for that problem. They go and help. So that's an important piece. And at the same time, they're also a very strong feedback loop. See, in traditional companies, usually the feedback loop is through support or services and delivery, where feedback is going to engineering and product. In the dev world, the DevRel itself is an immediate feedback loop. Hey, this doesn't work at all, or this is great, but it's missing these two features that either I can work with you to contribute back into an open source project, or I would love to talk to your product team to give feedback on. So I think for all dev-focused companies, DevRel is an important point. And if I talk about India as a market, it is, these roles do exist in the market. They are still evolving, but one should invest in it. And there are lots of different ways of getting DevRel to work on it. And I think this is a topic for another conversation. What does a developer advocate do? What does a DevRel do? Which we can talk about.
Interesting. Maneesh, slightly related to one thing that you mentioned, evangelism, right? Chris, this question has is also like a lot of founders are facing when they want to use influencers, like people who are respected in the developer world, who might have some following on, let's say, Twitter or other channels. Is there an efficient way to leverage that? Because if you take the counterpart in the consumer tech world, right? Let's say if it's a fashion company, it's pretty much a very straightforward process to get those influencers to promote your products. How does that work in the developer world?
Yeah, I mean, I personally don't have a ton of experience with these celebrity developers, right, that kind of promote your products. But I would say influencers can take many shapes, right? And one thing that I've seen done extremely successfully at Atlassian is the leverage of kind of people in your community to stand up as influencers and essentially promote your products and create or further expand that community around your product, right? So if you look at what Atlassian is doing, there are end users of the product that almost, at least prior to the pandemic, and it's starting to come back now, there were like 3 events per week globally that were organized by users of Atlassian, and they brought together 30, 40 people in specific, in cities all over the world, where they discussed specific problems that were around the or within the Atlassian economy or ecosystem, right? And I don't have experience with the celebrity ones, but certainly that model worked extremely, extremely well. And it was done in a very programmatic fashion in the end. You can imagine it's 3 events per week or whatever the scale is. There is a ton of them. Atlassian didn't take a very prominent role in these, but definitely was there to pay for the event in many ways, right? And had programs around like what the topic should be, how to encourage people to step up and do these things, systems to make those people stand out from the others so that they would be recognized as kind of experts in the ecosystem. So that was definitely a very powerful way. And I would second what Maneesh was saying. Use your own developers as well as influencers, right? I would say within Sentry, we have some really, really strong developers who can speak about certain topics with extreme expertise, and we leverage that, right? So they can talk about topics that are relevant to the community and get a following that way as well.
Interesting. And Chris, for the benefit of,
Sorry, I just wanted to add, I wanted to add a funny thing. So the influencers for a consumer brand on TikTok and YouTube is very different from the developer world, because you cannot go to a prominent influencer and say, hey, promote my product. It's exactly what Chris said. People who love your product, who are super fans, they're not waiting for you to tell them to evangelize your product. They would themselves go out and talk about, hey, this is a great problem being solved by this product. So you get immediate influences by even without looking for them.
Yeah.
Exactly. There might even be resentment against, I guess there will be more resentment against paid influencer marketing.
Developers are very discerning, by the way. Developers are very discerning.
Yeah.
Anyway,
shall we take a question from the audience?
Exactly.
Actually, quite a few questions have come. So I'm going to first read out a question from Maneesh, from Binny, from Project Pro. It's actually a very exciting company, addressed to Maneesh, but I know both of you can sort of take it, which is, could you help understand if the reseller model is still relevant for dev tools, GTM? And I think this comes from your very early discussion on resellers. So if either of you want to take that question, what's the relevance of reseller model to developer GTM?
I can kick it off and then hand over to Chris for his views. He has far more experience, I'm sure. I think it is relevant, but what you should ask in this question is the timing. So Chris talked a lot about the PLG piece. So for a dev focused company, as you get the bottoms up adoption, and then when you're starting the enterprise piece or getting broad, customer sales motion going, that's when probably a reseller makes sense. You cannot expect a reseller model to kick in for an unknown product / unknown category of problem that you're trying to solve, right? If, for example, observability is a great example, right? It's a known category. Problems are abound everywhere. Every customer is looking for a solution. There are lots of products that are there in the market. Now, why should a reseller carry your product? Because you're solving the observability problem. The reseller has heard this problem coming from customers. Hey, I have this problem. I'm looking at, let's say, taking a competitor's name. So that's when the reseller comes in. So a simple answer is yes, it is still relevant. There are resellers all over the world which carry DevTools products, all DevTools, whether it is Atlassian or any other product. I have enough examples, and there are many in India as well. But I think, Vinny, the more important point is the timing. So as soon as you start your dev company, it doesn't mean that you go out and sign resellers. And this same holds true for a SaaS company as well. It's not too different.
Yeah. I mean, I'll second that. I can tell from my experience at Atlassian that resellers were a key contributor to the success of Atlassian. And in fact, maybe as much so as the actual PLG motion itself. Now, it does depend on, I think, the type of product that you sell. With Atlassian, initially, there was a set of services that resellers could easily offer around the product that were relevant for them, where they could make money, right? Installing, actually, Jira, installing Confluence. They were setting up these behind the firewall systems. Later on, it became configuring Jira, setting it up for these integrations with other systems, etc., within the DevOps ecosystem. But and this is pretty much public information. Atlassian's revenues flow 30 to 50% flows through resellers essentially, right, at scale. And so it's a really big contributor to the actual go-to-market motion. Certainly when you get outside of, for Atlassian core markets like the US or Australia for us, right? So the further you get from the US, the more we actually relied on resellers to sell our products. With Sentry, we're looking into this, and it's a little bit of a different challenge because our product is maybe not as easy to wrap a set of services around. And so you have to think through these two things. It's like, is there going to be money in resellers selling the product, right? Are they going to be incentivized to sell it based on margin? That's one, but second, also based on incremental services that they can wrap around it so they can offer a more complete solution to customers that is a meaningful piece of business for them.
But Chris, is there a particular stage of the company at which this becomes relevant? Because I think there's two things, right? One is, and again, I would say Atlassian is an anomaly, right? Like, so for people to think that every company can emulate everything that Atlassian does is probably really unreasonable and unrealistic, right? There are a number of decisions that were made very early on that kind of set the trajectory for that company. But Atlassian resellers, in some ways, the ecosystem grew mostly out of existing users who loved the product and started promoting it to other people, and then figured out that they could build a business around it. So very kind of generally smaller resellers that resell their products initially, and then some larger ones came on board. But I would say in our case, at Sentry, for example, when you bring on resellers, you have to make sure that if you want them to sell the product for you, that you can educate them on how to sell the product, right? And so you have to have some experience internally on how to do that. You have to have the right playbooks ready so you can kind of go ahead and then propagate those to your ecosystem as well, so they can sell it. And then servicing is then the next layer down. How do you make sure that they can kind of support those sales motions with solution engineers, etc., and that you can build that business around it? So I would say, yes, from a timing perspective, it's like build some internal sales capabilities first, get the playbooks down, and then you can go out to these broader ecosystems and educate them. Because obviously the further you get away from the company, the less people are going to absorb what you try to, it's hard to educate a sales team on your value proposition, let alone somebody else's sales team who's also selling 5 or 15 or 20 other products, right? Very well put. Very well.
Also, I think, Alok, which is why, Chris talked about Atlassian being an anomaly, right? Because every customer was talking about Jira or an Atlassian product. So the resellers that were servicing those customers realized, I need to carry this product in my portfolio because my customer already knows it, they want to buy it, and I don't have that to offer.
Yeah.
So I think the PLG is also an important part of this cycle.
Yeah. Fair enough. Fair enough. I'm actually tempted to take a question out of order on the Q&A panel from Vishalini first. She's the founder of Zippy. I had it on my list to ask also, which is that let's assume that you have a freemium motion. It can be open source or some other methodology. When do you start thinking about monetization? So, with the freemium models or the PLG motion, developers come and sign up and stay with the free model. Assuming there is good adoption, how do you start converting these free users to paid users? Do you start making it subscription based as team adoption increases from individuals to team? Are there any other strategies that help you think about sort of when and how to start the monetization for your freemium product?
Complex question.
That's why we have you, Chris. So
Yeah, I think, I mean, I would start thinking about monetization immediately, right? Like you have to start thinking about, well, how am I going to offer a differentiated form of packaging or whatever it might be that I'm going to pay for. In the case of Sentry, open source to SaaS is a pretty straightforward value proposition, right? It's essentially the benefits of cloud hosting and not having to install it yourself. So it's a very straightforward value proposition that people are willing to pay for. That's straightforward. But thinking about where at what point you kind of topple over into the first paid tier of your product is something that you should start doing as soon as you have a number of users. I mean, I don't know what that number is, but like a sufficient number that you can start experimenting with it, I would say, right? And that you can start putting out some products, different variations of packaging, and kind of see what kind of traction you can get with that. Because it's not an easy problem to solve. Like there is, I've seen different examples. I think Jira does a pretty good job at it based on, when the team size grows to a certain number of users, you kind of start paying for the product, and that works. So you get some level of adoption initially, and then people start paying us, I think, as soon as they cross 10 users. Other products have struggled somewhat with it, right? Like Trello is a good example of where the free product is so good that, or Evernote is a well-known example, right? The free product was so good and so full-featured that nobody wanted to pay for the product. And so you have to start experimenting early on and really try to figure out like what are these features that people are going to be willing to pay for.
Yeah, totally agree with
no silver bullet for sure. No silver bullet there.
No silver bullet for sure. It is a complex question, Alok. I think 2 parts to it. One is open source / open core. And the second is a regular, Evernote, Trello kind of company that Chris talked about.
Yeah.
There you start with the freemium piece. You figure out what is it that is valuable for the user to pay for. You have to identify that. I think on the open source part, you figure things along as you go along. It might sound like a stupid answer, but that's what I have predominantly seen for many, many years across a lot of open source companies. The decision on, are people going to pay for services and support? Are people going to pay for, hosting? Should it be a hosted managed service that, while it is free and open source, but they want the creators to manage it? Or is there an open core with premium paid features on top of it that, the enterprises / developers will pay for? I think that is something that the founding team have to start thinking about it. And that's the important point, because the split between an open source project and open core company comes in. Open source project is for open sourcing for everybody to use. You're not thinking about monetization. You are a developer at heart. You want more and more contributions, etc. But if you're starting with an open core company, the thought process is you're trying to create this into a business. So as Chris said, right from the moment you decide to create an open core company, you have to start thinking about, okay, what should my experiments be with my users so that I can figure out what is it that they will pay for?
Yeah. And again, while I know very little on the topic, I'm going to chime in nonetheless with a slightly contrarian answer, is that if you're an early stage startup, actually don't be in a rush early on. I feel that developer products have a very strong virality, and that virality can work against you as well. If you start charging for something where the product market fit or the value was not really proven yet, you might end up sort of shooting yourself in the foot as well. So take your time, be very sure-footed. Once you have sufficient number of users and you are confident of the value you're delivering to your users, at that point start experimenting with the pricing, which is important, and you will never know the right answer. But it can be enterprise features, it can be a hosted version. I know there are very many different strategies with which you can monetize, but
Yep.
yes, you will need to do that experiment. Very often, at least if I compare it to let's say freemium applications versus open source or developer focused, I find that in the developer focused world, it takes slightly longer to get to the monetization point head to head if I compare it to the apps, at least, that I've seen sort of going to market as well.
If I can also
Yeah, I
add
would
this one
agree.
point.
I was going
Go
to
ahead,
say,
Chris.
I would agree, Alok. Yeah, you have to get at least some level of confidence that you have product market fit, right? And that your product is kind of propagating itself, and then you can start experimenting with pricing attributes.
Yep. I was also going to chime in and say you're absolutely right. I think as you get more adoption, it eventually becomes easy for you as a founder or a sales team of that company to go to the buying center and say, hey, you've got 50 users in your organizations who are already using my product. Let me now tell you how I can add more value so that you're more efficient, etc. So that's also what I've seen work.
I'm going to take a question from someone who is attending as an anonymous attendee. It's an interesting question, and probably Maneesh, you might be in a better position to take this because it seems very specific to GitHub, which is that there are so many different metrics people measure on GitHub: pull request, stars, contributors. At an early stage, if you are an open source company, what metric would you actually really worry about the most? And what do these tell you?
Simple answer to that question is contributors.
Okay.
See, stars are good. Star means that other developers like your product. But let me take a step back to that 2x2 matrix that I talked about. High contributor growth, low contributor growth, high user growth, low user growth, right? So if you have low contributors and low user, it's like a toy project, right? There's no adoption. Yes, it is open source. Nobody's coming and using it. Nobody's coming and contributing to it.
Yeah.
You have low contributors, but high users, it's also a good thing, right? So you have deep people worried about maintaining the product, and you have tremendous user adoption. So whenever I look at a successful open source project, stars are a good metric. It means people are looking at what you're doing, but I always go back and look at where are the contributors coming from. And I think I talked about it in the beginning where I said, if I'm an open core company and if I have 50 developers, are those 50 the only ones that are contributing to the open source project of mine? Then it's not really driving adoption all over the world, right? Yeah. You need a developer somewhere in Sao Paulo, somewhere in Brussels, somewhere in Berlin, somewhere in Melbourne to be excited about your project to be able to contribute. Because, if you peel the onion of open source, I said that it's not always about distribution. There are lots of other things. It's the accelerated engineering, because you have contributors who might be smarter than you are, who are coming and helping you figure out which features to prioritize. So I think contributors is what I would look for the most. And going back to the DevRel question, Alok, the stars are a good DevRel kind of a metric that you can use to drive adoption, drive awareness. Hey, I've got 5,000 stars, 10,000 stars. It means that developers are looking at this project. And the reason they're looking at this project and liking it is because the problem that the project is solving is relevant to what problem they're facing. So the more number of stars means that more users like what this project is doing and want to use it. So both have different connotations, but I personally look at the contributor piece.
Got it.
I hope I answered the question and
Yeah.
didn't confuse people.
You did. I'm actually taking another question from Shailendra. I'm going to make it broader here. His question is, while specific to GitHub, but I'm going to broaden it. So the question is that, while when you put something out there, it's available to everyone, but how do you make it discoverable? And are there any tools to make your project or your product sort of gain some early momentum? And the reason I'm asking is that, Maneesh, you made this comment and early in the discussion is that, look, developers don't want to be marketed to. They have a problem, they'll figure out where they want to go for their solution. And if that's the case, I'm sure there are thousands and thousands of products, and I noticed, Chris, that you are an advisor to OpenView also. And I've read some sort of scary statistics on the number of projects which are out there these days. With so many out there, how do you create discoverability for your own project, for your own product? Even if you're not charging for it, that's fine. But how do you create discoverability?
I mean, I can, like, the simplicity, like, I don't know the kind of GitHub answer to this as to how you create discoverability on GitHub, but I would say ultimately you need to solve a problem, right? And so SEO is the way to get to it. So you're going to have, at least, I mean, I look at like how certainly Atlassian became successful and some of these companies have gotten traction. It's like, write good documentation of what you're doing and make sure that it's discoverable and optimized for SEO. And somehow that will start to build momentum around it. But yeah, that may be later than what you need to do on GitHub to gain traction. But ultimately, it's like, you have to describe the problem, you have to describe the solution, and you have to describe in the documentation in fairly elaborate detail how it works, so that people can get it to work on their own and fast. And I think that's how you build that kind of momentum around really the flywheel of inbound traffic as well from an SEO perspective.
Just a specific question there on that. What do you think about, let's say, product hunt? What role will product hunt have for several products for discoverability? Or let's say, if you start asking your developers to become very active on Stack Overflow or Reddit, does that also like sound interesting to you?
I mean, I think they're all interesting. It's just a matter of like, how do you build momentum? And early momentum is going to come from like, you have to somehow get it in the hands of a number of people that are going to like it and start propagating it, right? And then you can use all these other means to amplify that. But it's just, the very early stages of this, I've actually not experienced, so I can't really talk authoritatively about it.
Sure.
But that's how I would do it ultimately, right? Like, make sure that it's useful, get people to use it and recommend it to each other, and keep building on that with all the other means that you have, like forums, like Discord channels, like SEO with documentation, etc.
So if to synthesize, Chris, what you're essentially saying, the core of the discoverability strategy has to be SEO. That is what
I don't, that's my answer, but
Sure.
I'm not necessarily an expert on
that makes
on
sense. No, got it.
If I can add on that, Anagh, I think I would like to correct myself, Alok. Developers do like marketing too.
Okay.
But it's not your traditional marketing. I think I'm building on what Chris was saying. You definitely have to, whether it is your GitHub project or your own website, clear documentation, because developers read documentation because they want to use your product. Think about it. Swag, developer project giving swag, that is marketing, right? Going out into forums, that is marketing. You talked about product hunt, Anagh, right? That is marketing. Going and answering questions on Quora, that is marketing, right? So the marketing aspects of a developer company might be slightly different.
Yeah.
You don't do in-your-face marketing to a developer. You actually go out and be where they are so that they are discovering you. So I like to tell a few folks who are doing dev companies that these are like landmines, right? You lay breadcrumbs and landmines all over where developers are going, because you don't know what they will step on to discover you, but you have to be out there. It's like opening a web commerce store. Just because I've opened a a Magento commerce store doesn't mean that a shopper will discover me. I have to go out and attract people to my shop. Once you've attracted people to your shop, why should they buy? Why should they use? I think that's where documentation becomes important. For the project that you've hosted on GitHub, for example, then you need to have a lot of things put right. Is the license clear? Documentation, is it clear? Have you made it clear on how people should be raising pull requests? Are issues being tracked, right? If a developer comes to your project and sees there are 100 issues that are open, but they haven't been actioned for the last 3 months, then they feel, oh, okay, the maintainer doesn't really care about feedback. They'll not come again. So there are these nuanced things that you have to look at to get people to contribute, to use, and discover your project. So going back, Alok, marketing, but in a very different way to the dev community.
Understand. You know what is exciting about today's discussion is that somebody, after so many times, has finally asked a question to the VCs on the panel as well. Nobody asks VCs anything because they know that they don't know anything. But I'm going to read it out for Anagh here, which is that as VCs, you have visibility into many dev SaaS companies in the portfolio and outside. In your experience, what part of the GTM is the one that most people struggle with? What part do most people think is easy but is not? And the flip side, what part do most people think is difficult but is not?
Interesting. Should I take the first crack, Alok?
Yeah, go for it, Anagh, go for it.
Interesting. So what part of the GTM, I think, I would say discoverability, the problem that we're talking about right now, right? Discoverability at the right places. While being in India, one challenge is that there is a limited set of companies that you can end up going to. And therefore, the network effects that you'll probably have in the valley, that unfortunately doesn't exist right now. It's changing rapidly. So your friend and your friend's friend, that kind of a network is harder to find, which can probably be easier if you're a part of the valley ecosystem. That is changing very rapidly. So the very early piece of getting to the right people, right, and getting that feedback of how to go about the messaging of the product and so on. There, I think, like people are talking to probably 10 people right now. In the founders that we have met, should probably talk to 100 people, and that would mean a bit more hustle. That would mean getting more active on the forums and so on. So the very early part of getting that feedback from the right set of folks who have probably seen 10 other competitors or adjacents to what you're already doing. That is a bit harder right now, building out of India, but that's changing very rapidly, and like the best founders are actually leapfrogging that.
Maybe I'll add to your answer, Anagh, here, and this is addressed to Akshay. Akshay, I think fundamentally I find that most founders are coming from very strong technology backgrounds, especially if it's a developer-focused product. These are going to be engineers who have started. I think we heard the example that Chris also gave, that the founder of Sentry was a developer at Dropbox. And that's very common in these situations. I don't think that the natural muscle for many people happens to be go-to-market. And therefore, in fact, most things lie in the struggle or difficult sort of questions that they worry about all the time. At least that's been our experience, that they don't need as much advice on the product side, but they need a lot more advice on the go-to-market side. Everything we have discussed on this forum today, which is whether we should think about an open source strategy, whether it's a classical freemium, whether it's a free trial. There are so many different ways to go to market. Even if you begin to, somebody asked, Vishalini, I think asked a question on when do you begin to monetize? What should be the basis for monetization? That's also a very hard question. When should you have resellers? When should you not? And the challenge is that these questions change by stage. I think very often, like product market fit, there is a belief that once there is a go to market fit and once you have found it, all you need to put is more fuel to the fire. It actually never happens. With every stage of growth, your questions in go-to-market become very different. Like I think Chris referred to it. Once you become large enough, you find that in many large companies, procurement starts getting involved. Now, guess what? that brings an enterprise go-to-market motion at that point in time, something that you are not doing earlier. So the problems you will begin to encounter are different. The problems you see at a whatever, I don't know, $10,000 ACV is different than 50,000, is different than 500,000 also. So it's a continuous process. I can't think of too many things which people think is difficult, but it is not. But I also don't believe that most founders thinks that it is too easy. There are very few who actually think it is too easy. I think they do recognize that these are all hard problems. And as they go along the journey, first they will discover the problems and the solutions to those problems.
Actually, two short things to add there, right? On the what do founders think it's easy? I found a lot of founders thinking that building virality in the product will be easy. And one of the common, I would say, conundrums there is that a lot of founders assume that word of mouth equates virality. Word of mouth, of course, is very, very important, and that is how the product ends up going. But word of mouth can happen for any product, which is good, right? When we are talking about product level virality, it's more about what are you building into the product, which will lead to, let's say, more clicks, backlinks, and so on. And I think a leaf can be taken from consumer tech founders on that. So we have to think about virality beyond word of mouth, and it's not that easy as people think, I believe. And the second part, what is difficult, I think probably what Chris was talking about earlier, right? Sales being very alien, probably foreign to a lot of PLG native founders. So there is this connotation that we don't have to touch sales. If we have to get into sales, we are probably doing something wrong. Our product led motion is not really working, but it's not as alien as you think. Like, you have to build that culture and familiarity. The onus is on you to start thinking about it.
Alok, if I can add one point.
Sure.
This is I know we're near the hour. This is for all founders and the tech teams here to think about. I think India is a great place. This is one of the largest developer markets in the world. This is also the market which influences a lot of other markets. If you look at all the system integrators are here. If you look at all the GCCs or GICs are here, right? And for you as tech founders or dev companies, this is an audience which is sitting here. So, as you start off and start to scratch your head, how do I go and do events in the US? I think you should start off with connecting with developers here. You'd be surprised. You'd be surprised if you convince a bunch of developers in Target, for example, in India, to use your product, which would influence Target in the US to use your product as well. That is very unique for us in India. So I think, more than SaaS, I think the dev go-to-market, the dev-focused companies in India have a tremendous opportunity to have an impact in the world, which is very, very unique. And think about it.
I would agree with that. Like, it is substantial. Like, big markets are a big advantage. If you found in a big market, you have a big advantage. You go in the US, you go in India, you go in China. You have so many users that speak one language. Like all the simple things that are allowing for easy propagation are there. And I think it's a massive advantage compared to like starting a company in Belgium, for example, where I'm from, right? Where you just go beyond your borders immediately to get to more than 2 million users.
Great. Chris, Maneesh, thank you so much for being there. And Chris, particularly, I know it's 10 p.m. your time already in California. So
no worries.
We appreciate your coming here, and thank you to everyone being there.